In this lesson, I'm going to walk you through the basics of how to check your models for errors and mistakes, and how you can use some visual aids within Excel and the corresponding shortcut keys to greatly accelerate the process and to help you find some of these mistakes and correct them more quickly. So the first concept here that I want to go over is what you might have actually seen before when we were going through the circularity and iterations within Excel, and that's how to create arrows to precedence and dependence for cells. And what we mean by precedence and dependence are precedence refer to any type of input that is feeding into the cell, and then dependence refer to when the cell itself, what's in there, is used in other cells throughout the worksheets. So the shortcuts to do that are Alt-TUT for tracing precedence. We see here that the circularity breaker feeds into our interest, income, or expense. And then scrolling down, we see that the net interest expense at the bottom also goes into it. So Alt-TUT for tracing precedence, and then Alt-TUD for tracing dependence. It's hard to see there, so let me just erase everything. So Alt-TUD for tracing dependence. We see here that the only place this interest expense is being used is in the pre-tax income on this line. So nothing terribly complicated there, but this can be a very useful visual aid for tracing through all your Excel worksheets and making sure that everything's okay, that everything's flowing in the right direction. To erase this, we just press Alt-TUA to delete any type of arrows. So again, Alt-TUT to trace precedence, in this case the circularity breaker, and then the net interest expense at the bottom. Alt-TUA to delete the arrows, Alt-TUD to trace dependence, in this case just the pre-tax income or EBT, and then Alt-TUA to delete the arrows. And we can see how we might apply this to lots of other areas as well. See here under debt repayment, if we do Alt-TUT for that, we see that the cash available for debt repayment is paying into it. Alt-TUT for that one, we see that these three variables, the beginning cash balance, free cash flow, and minimum cash balance, are all feeding into that. So this is just very useful when you're going through and trying to fix errors and mistakes in your spreadsheets. And another useful point to point out here is that if you press the keys repeatedly, then you keep getting the next precedence or next dependence. So if you press Alt-TUT, and then Alt-TUT again, then you start getting all these other precedents. So you can see how the cash interest rate, the debt interest rate are all feeding into these items below, and you basically can trace the entire order on your spreadsheet of what's going into what. And the same for dependence as well. So you can literally watch the trace of the arrow going down on the screen. And you see the exact order and what everything else is feeding into below. So again, very useful for fixing errors and problems in your spreadsheets and making sure that the order and all the formulas are flowing correctly. Now another related feature that you can use, another shortcut, is to trace all precedents, whether they're direct or indirect. So the Alt-TUT key just shows us the direct precedents, in other words, which variables are directly feeding into our interest expense right here. But let's say, for example, that we want to look at everything that's indirectly going in there as well. Then we press Shift Control left bracket, and we see here that a bunch of cells are now highlighted, and these are all the indirect precedents. So these are all the variables that indirectly end up on our interest expense line. And we see that a lot of different things on this spreadsheet are highlighted, which makes sense because the interest expense here at the bottom and everything that comes above it actually feeds into our interest expense indirectly right here. Now if we want to do the same thing for dependence, then we press Shift Control right bracket key. And we see here, this is not particularly helpful here because basically everything in this model depends on our interest expense in this 1 year. And the same goes for many of the items here. So it's not terribly useful for an LBO model like this because everything's interrelated and you have all these circular references. But for other types of models, the Shift Control left and the Shift Control right brackets are quite useful for just figuring out what's going on and for figuring out everything that's indirectly feeding into your one formula on this line. And then another related shortcut is you can actually jump to these precedent and dependent cells. And the way you do that is with Control left bracket for precedent cells. You can press Enter to jump between them. So we're jumping between the circularity breaker and the net interest expense there. And then you press F5 and Enter to jump back. Now this Control left arrow bracket is probably one of the top 20 or so shortcuts that you'll use in Excel on a daily basis because it's so useful to jump back and forth and go directly to the cells that feed into your current cell. And then this F5 and Enter to jump back is also extremely useful. So you'll find yourself using those all the time in Excel. So I would strongly suggest memorizing them and starting to use them as soon as possible whenever you create or work on other models. You can also press Control right arrow bracket to jump to dependents, which in this case is just the pre-tax income. So it's not terribly useful here because we just have this one dependent. So this one sort of depends on how your model is set up and what you're looking at specifically. I would say that tracing precedents with Control left bracket is far more common than tracing dependents. But again, you never know where you're going to use it, so it's worthwhile to know both of these shortcuts. And then of course the F5 plus Enter combination to move back to the original cell is very useful because even if you haven't named it something, if you've entered the precedent cells with Control bracket, then you can easily get back to the original cell that you were starting in. So for your exercise, what I want you to do is pretty simple here. And basically all you have to do is set up this model so that the interest expense is showing the arrows, showing the precedents and dependents for each of these interest expense lines. So I'm going to do it right now, and I'm not going to tell you what the shortcuts are, but I'm going to do it, and then I want you to give it a shot yourself, pause the video, and then once you've finished it, or if you get stuck, unpause it, and I'll walk you through it with the shortcuts this time. So we'll enter precedence right here, dependence, dependence here. And so on and so forth. And we have everything listed there. So now we see that the circularity breaker is feeding into all these. And then the interest expense here at the bottom is also going into all these. So we see exactly why this is a circular reference, because the interest expense here at the bottom is going into it, and this interest expense at the top is feeding into pre-tax income and flowing throughout the rest of the income statement, cash flow statement, and debt and cash schedules here at the bottom. So give that a shot yourself using the keyboard shortcuts that I just went over. If you get stuck or want to check your work, just unpause this video once you've paused it, and then I'll walk you through it more slowly and give you all the shortcuts this time. Okay, good. So first things first, I'm going to delete all these arrows with Alt-TUA to remove the arrows. And then to enter precedence here, I'm going to press Alt-TUT. That gives us a trace of the precedence. So net interest expense at the bottom, and then circularity breaker here at the top. Then Alt-TUD for dependence. And then the same for the next one, Alt-TUT for precedence, Alt-TUD for dependence. Alt-TUT, Alt-TUD. And then Alt-TUT, Alt-TUD here at the end. So those are the basics of how you set this up and complete the trace of precedence and dependence for interest expense in an LBO model. Again, if you have a really complex model, it can be really handy to do this. For a basic LBO model, it's usually not too complex, but it can still help you if you run into problems. One other last point I'll mention here is that this only works if you have a flat model. In other words, your model is just this one tab like we have here, this basic LBO model. If we had multiple tabs and this were going across multiple sheets, then arrow tracing would not work then. It needs to all be on the same sheet. So do keep that in mind as you go through this and start to fix problems in your own models. But it is very, very useful, and I strongly recommend using it when you're going through and trying to find problems with your own models. Coming up next, I'm going to be showing you how to enter comments on your formulas and your variables and constants within Excel. And then we're going to be getting into some more advanced formula and formula related features in Excel.